200 years ago, one corner of the United States was almost completely stripped bare. Settlers cut down nearly every tree across an area the size of several countries, plowed the land into farms, and wiped out the wolves, the cougars, the moose, the beaver, even the wild turkey. By the 1800s, it looked less like America and more like the bare hills of modern-day Scotland. And then, without any grand plan, without bulldozers or replanting crews, something extraordinary began to happen. The people left, and the forest came back, on a scale that scientists now call one of the greatest accidental rewilding events in the history of the planet. To understand how a dead landscape resurrected itself, you first have to understand just how completely it was destroyed. Across the 6 states of New England, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, together with the Adirondack region of upstate New York, there once stretched a vast, ancient woodland. This was the Northern Forest, a sprawling blend of temperate and boreal trees that ran unbroken from the coast to the mountains. When European colonists first arrived in the early 1600s, forest covered an estimated 90% or more of the entire region. It was an old, deep, living wilderness. Towering white pines, some said to reach 200 feet, rose above sugar maple, beech, hemlock, and oak. Beneath the canopy moved an entire community of large animals: gray wolves, eastern cougars, moose, elk, black bears, lynx, and beaver. By the millions. Rivers ran thick with fish. The forest floor held over 2,000 species of plants. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples had lived within this landscape, shaping it with fire and cultivation while leaving its essential wildness intact. To the colonists who stepped off their ships, however, this endless forest was not a treasure. It was an obstacle. It was timber to be cut, fuel to be burned, and above all, land to be cleared so that crops could be planted and livestock could graze. And so they began to take it apart. The destruction of the northern forest was one of the most thorough deforestations in American history, and it happened with astonishing speed. At first, the colonists cleared the forest for the obvious necessities, including lumber to build homes and ships, firewood to survive the brutal New England winters, and charcoal to fuel early industry. But the real devastation came with agriculture. As the population grew and spread inland through the 1700s and the 1800s, settlers felled the trees across hillside after hillside to open up pasture and cropland. Then, around 1811, a man named William Jarvis introduced the merino sheep from Spain, and the region exploded into a sheep farming frenzy. By 1840, there were an estimated 4 million sheep grazing New England, more sheep than people, and feeding them demanded clearing still more forest. The scale of the loss was staggering. By the mid-1800s, between 60 and 80% of New England had been stripped of its trees. In the hardest-hit states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, up to 70% of the forest was gone. In many older towns, forest cover collapsed to as little as 10 to 25%. Whole counties that had been dense woodland for 10,000 years became open, rolling farmland crisscrossed by stone walls. Those famous New England stone walls, the ones that now wind mysteriously through deep forest, were built during this era. They exist because the settlers had so completely run out of wood that they were forced to fence their fields with stones pulled from the soil. The consequences went beyond the loss of trees and animals. With the forest cover gone, the land itself began to suffer. Bare hillsides eroded in heavy rain. Soil washed into rivers, clogging them with sediment. Streams that had once been shaded and cool by the canopy now ran warm and exposed, and flooding grew more frequent and more severe without the forest to absorb the rainfall. The clearing had been so complete that local firewood became scarce, and towns increasingly had to ship in coal and lumber from elsewhere just to keep warm, a sign of just how thoroughly the region had consumed its own natural wealth. The animals vanished alongside the trees. As the forest fell, the creatures that depended on it were hunted, trapped, and driven out with ruthless efficiency. The beaver, prized for its fur, was trapped almost to local extinction. The wolf and the cougar, seen as threats to livestock, were targeted with bounties and systematically exterminated. The last wolves in the region were shot in the 1800s, and the eastern cougar was wiped out entirely. But the slaughter did not stop at predators. Even the most ordinary game animals were eliminated. Moose disappeared from most of the region. Wild turkey, once abundant, was completely extirpated from New England by the mid-1800s, gone from the entire region. White-tailed deer became scarce. The conservationist John Leibowitz, who has spent his career studying this landscape, describes the end state plainly. Carnivores like wolves and cougars were driven out. Even the most common prey, deer and turkey, were gone. The land, in his words, was unwell. An ecosystem that had taken 10,000 years to assemble had been dismantled in roughly 200. By the mid-19th century, large stretches of the Northeast were a hollow, treeless, animal-poor landscape. It was a place that, as Leibowitz puts it, looked eerily like the bare, deforested hills of modern Scotland. And then the people who had done all this clearing began, quietly, to leave. The recovery did not begin with a conservation movement or a government decree. It began with economics. In the mid-1800s, two great forces pulled New England's farmers off the land. First, the opening of the American West revealed something painful. The deep, rich, stone-free soils of Ohio, Indiana, and beyond were vastly easier and more productive to farm than the thin, rocky, hard-won fields of New England. Second, the rise of railroads and industrial cities offered work in the mills and factories of a rapidly modernizing nation. One by one, then by the thousands, New England's farming families gave up. They walked away from their pastures, their croplands, and their stone-walled fields, heading west for better soil or into the cities for steady wages. What they left behind was something no one had planned. Millions of acres of open, abandoned land, sitting empty, waiting. And nature, as it always does when given the chance, moved in. On its own, with no human help whatsoever, the forest began to return. The process is called natural succession, and on the abandoned farms of New England, it unfolded with remarkable speed. First came the hardy pioneer species, grasses, then shrubs, then fast-growing, sun-loving trees like white pine, birch, and aspen, their seeds carried in on the wind to colonize the open fields. These early trees grew up and shaded the ground, and beneath their cover, the slower, longer-lived hardwoods took root, the maple, oak, beech, and hemlock that form a mature northern forest. Field by field, decade by decade, the woodland clawed its way back across the landscape at a pace that, in Leibowitz's words, nearly rivaled the speed of the axework that had cleared it. The transformation over the following century was almost beyond belief. A region that had been as little as 25% forested in the mid-1800s is, today, around 80% forest. New England has gone from one of the most heavily deforested corners of the country to one of the most densely wooded regions in the entire world. Stone walls that once divided open sheep pasture now run through shady, mature woodland, the only remaining clue that any of it was ever farmland at all. It is, as scientists have noted, the only forest of its kind to have fully regrown and expanded within the past century anywhere on Earth. There is one important caveat to this recovery, however. While the forest came back in terms of sheer acreage, what returned was young forest, not the ancient woodland that had been lost. The logging across the region had been so intense and so complete that, as of recent surveys, less than 1% of New England's forest qualifies as true old growth, the towering, centuries-old, cathedral-like forest the colonists first encountered. Almost everything green in New England today is, in ecological terms, a teenager. That distinction matters enormously, because the oldest forests are also the richest in wildlife and the most powerful at storing carbon, and they are precisely the kind that takes the longest to rebuild. As the trees returned, the animals followed them home. This was the part that truly stunned ecologists: the wholesale return of wildlife that had been gone for generations. As the forest matured and hunting was finally regulated, species began recolonizing their ancestral range, most of them entirely on their own. The beaver came back and got straight to work, damming streams and rebuilding the wetlands its ancestors had maintained for millennia. The black bear recolonized its old territory naturally. The moose, the largest member of the deer family, a 1,000-pound animal that had vanished from most of the region, wandered back down out of Canada and the northern woods, reclaiming forests from Maine all the way to Massachusetts. Wild turkey, which had been completely wiped out, was reintroduced and now thrives across the whole region, its flocks a common sight at forest edges. White-tailed deer rebounded so successfully they became superabundant. Bobcat, fisher, river otter, bald eagle, and peregrine falcon all returned. The Adirondack Park in upstate New York became a showcase for this recovery. River otter, fisher, bobcat, black bear, beaver, common loon, bald eagle, and peregrine falcon, species that had been nearly extirpated a century earlier, all rebounded, the vast majority through natural recolonization once the killing was limited and the habitat was allowed to regrow. By the dawn of the 21st century, more beavers, more moose, and more wild canines roamed the Adirondacks than at any point in the previous 100 years. An entire continent's worth of wildlife had quietly come home. Behind this accidental recovery, a deliberate one was also taking shape. Even as the forest regrew on its own, a handful of visionary decisions helped guarantee that some of it would stay wild forever. In 1892, New York State created the Adirondack Park and enshrined a remarkable clause in the state constitution declaring its public lands forever wild, protecting nearly 3 million acres from logging and development in perpetuity. In 1931, Baxter State Park was established in Maine, eventually growing to protect 182,000 acres of forever wild land surrounding the state's highest peak. And in 1964, the Federal Wilderness Act created hundreds of thousands of acres of protected wilderness across New England. These protected cores became the anchors of the recovery, large, secure blocks of habitat where forests could grow old and complex, and where wide-ranging wildlife could find refuge. Around them grew a uniquely American invention, the land trusts. The modern land trust movement was pioneered in New England, and these private, non-profit organizations began buying up land specifically to protect it. Today, remarkably, about 80% of the Northeast is in private hands, which means that conservation organizations, not the federal government, have become the key players in protecting the region's wild places. A quarter of all the protected wildlands in the Northeast have been conserved by these private groups. One organization decided to take that idea to its purest possible form. The Northeast Wilderness Trust, founded in 2002 and based in Vermont, is the only land trust in the entire northeastern United States focused exclusively on what it calls forever wild conservation. Its philosophy is radical in its simplicity. Most conservation groups protect land for human use, for sustainable timber, for recreation, for farming. The Wilderness Trust protects land for the land's own sake, permanently shielding it from both development and active management, so that natural processes can unfold with as little human interference as possible. They protect land, in the words of their leader John Leibowitz, for the four-legged, the finned, the feathered, and the rooted. Their approach embraces a profound idea, that a forest does not have to be pristine old growth to be worth protecting as wilderness. A recently logged woodland, or even a former cow pasture, can be set aside as forever wild, and given enough time, it will develop into old forest all on its own. As one of their preserves demonstrates, a spot in Massachusetts that was bare, deforested farmland in the 1880s is today a rich woodland steadily growing back toward old growth. The lesson is that you do not always have to actively rebuild nature. Sometimes you simply have to give it space, protect it, and then step back and let time do the work. By 2025, the Wilderness Trust had surpassed 100,000 acres of forever wildland conserved across the region, habitat for moose, bobcat, black bear, fisher, and countless forest birds, much of it positioned in critical wildlife corridors that allow animals to roam freely between protected blocks. The science makes a powerful case for why letting forests grow truly wild matters so much. Research compiled in a landmark 2023 report called Wildlands in New England, produced by Harvard Forest, the Highstead Foundation, and the Northeast Wilderness Trust, laid out the stakes with hard data. The evidence shows that the forever wild approach can cut biodiversity loss on protected lands roughly in half, while simultaneously storing far more carbon than actively managed forests. The reason is straightforward. The wilder, older, and more structurally diverse a forest becomes, the more effective it is at both sheltering rare species and pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Allowing forests to grow old, untouched, turns out to be one of the lowest cost, highest impact tools available for fighting both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis at the same time. And yet the report revealed a startling gap. Although roughly 81% of New England is now forested, only about 3.3% of the region has been permanently protected as true wildland, forest guaranteed the freedom to grow old and wild. The overwhelming majority of the recovered forest is young, managed, and vulnerable. The great comeback, in other words, is real, but it is also fragile and incomplete. There is one piece of the original ecosystem that has still not come home, and it is the most important one of all. When the wolves and cougars were exterminated, the northern forest lost its apex predators, the animals that once kept deer and moose populations in balance, and in doing so, shaped the health of the entire forest. In their absence, a newcomer has filled part of the gap. The eastern coyote, larger than its western cousin, thanks to wolf genes mixed into its ancestry, has spread across the region and taken over much of the predator role. But scientists are clear that the coyote is not a full replacement. Research has found that eastern coyotes cannot prey on deer and moose as effectively or as consistently as wolves once did. A crucial layer of the ecosystem is still missing. That may, however, be starting to change on its own. Wolves are naturally pushing south from Canada. One was killed in upstate New York in 2001. Others were confirmed in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom. Conservationists argue that with the right protections, especially better rules to stop wolves from being shot by hunters who mistake them for coyotes, the wolf could one day complete the rewilding of the northern forest, returning the final missing piece to a landscape that has rebuilt almost everything else. Today, the northern forest stands as living proof of something both humbling and hopeful, that nature, given the chance, can heal on a scale almost beyond human imagination. Where 200 years ago there were bare, sheep-cropped hills and silent, animal-empty fields, there are now deep, shaded woodlands echoing with birdsong, patrolled by bears and bobcats, browsed by thousand-pound moose, and threaded with streams rebuilt by beavers. Tens of millions of people now live within this recovered forest, most of them with no idea that the trees around their towns are barely a century old, growing up from land their great-great-grandparents had stripped to the bone. What this story teaches reaches far beyond New England. The first part of the lesson is the sheer, stubborn resilience of the living world. No one engineered this recovery. There was no master plan, no army of planters, no fleet of machines. The forest came back because people stepped aside and the land was simply allowed to follow its own ancient instructions. Seeds blew in, roots took hold, animals wandered home. Given space and given time, a dead landscape resurrected itself, which means the natural world is far more forgiving and far more powerful than we usually dare to believe. The second part of the lesson is a warning wrapped in that hope. The recovery is not finished and it is not guaranteed. For the first time in over a century, the northern forest has begun to shrink again. Not from farming this time, but from sprawling development, which erases forest in a way that is hard and permanent. New England is now losing forests to bulldozers, and only a tiny fraction of the great comeback has been locked in as truly, permanently wild. The story could still go either way. A landscape that was stripped bare 2 centuries ago rebuilt itself into one of the wildest places in the Eastern world simply because human beings, for once, got out of the way. Whether it stays that way is the chapter being written right now. And it turns out that the most powerful thing we can sometimes do for the natural world is not to plant, or build, or manage, or fix, but simply to let it be and to protect the space where it can become wild again on its own.